one machine every 17 minutes. Not per day, not per shift, every 17 minutes, around the clock, 7 days a week, through some of the most desperate years the world had ever seen. While ships went down in the Pacific, while tanks burned in the African desert, while sirens screamed over London, in one American city, in one set of factory buildings, machine after machine rolled off the floor with a precision no war had ever demanded before. In 1942, 1 out of every 12 machine tools manufactured in the United States carried the same name. 1 in 12. Not Ford, not General Electric, a company most Americans had never heard of, in a city whose greatest contribution to the war effort was invisible, ground into pistons, bored into gun barrels, pressed into the bearings that kept a democracy's engines turning. What does it mean to win a war with machine tools? What does it mean when one city, one factory, one family decides, not on a battlefield, but in Ohio, the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history? This is the story of Cincinnati grinders. It begins, as so many American industrial stories do, with an inheritance and the right friendship. In 1874, a young man named George Mueller inherited his father's modest machine shop on Vine Street in Cincinnati, Ohio. The elder Mueller had built a small reputation making parts for sewing machines and repairing whatever anyone brought through the door. George was practical enough to know he couldn't run it alone, and smart enough to ask his friend Fred Holes to join him. Holes was the kind of man who looked at a piece of metal and saw not a material, but a problem to be solved. For the first few years, they did what the shop had always done: repaired, maintained, turned parts on order. But by 1876, the two men had found their real direction. The expanding American economy needed fasteners, threads, and precision connectors at a scale that hand tools could never supply. Mueller and Holes reorganized around the screw machine and its related tooling, the taps and dies that cut threads into metal. By 1884, their enterprise was formally incorporated as the Cincinnati Screw and Tap Company. Not a glamorous name, but an accurate one. The decisive break came in 1889, and it was not an economic decision, but an intellectual one. Fred Holes understood something that most manufacturers of the era did not: that the tools used to make tools were worth more than the tools themselves. In that year, he separated the milling machine work from the screw and tap business entirely, and, together with his financial partner Frederick A. Geyer, incorporated the Cincinnati Milling Machine Company. In that same year, Holes designed the company's first cutter grinder, a machine that allowed factories to sharpen their own cutting tools in-house rather than buying new ones. The cost savings were immediate and obvious. The first export order, to a Swedish manufacturer, arrived the following year. Geyer, who eventually bought out Holes's stake in 1905, was the organizational mind the company needed. He saw that the machine tool industry's center of gravity was shifting westward, and he was determined to be ahead of it. In 1907, he purchased 102 acres in the Oakley neighborhood east of Cincinnati, a site large enough to build not just a factory, but an industrial colony. By 1911, the new complex was complete: a foundry, a power plant, machining halls with over 6 acres of floor space. At the time, it was described as the world's largest factory devoted exclusively to milling machines. Geyer's timing was not luck. The automobile had arrived, and America's hunger for precision metal components was about to become insatiable. But the years immediately before the early 1920s brought a reckoning. By 1920, the company had 1,004 workers and 561 unsold machines sitting in inventory. The economic downturn forced brutal decisions. Management salaries were cut, wages reduced by 15%, and the workforce fell to just 250 by 1921. It was in the middle of this contraction that a young man named Frederick V. Geyer, the founder's son, recently returned from the Western Front, where he had personally fixed production problems on 75mm artillery pieces, walked into the boardroom and proposed something that would change the company's trajectory entirely. He proposed grinding. In September 1921, Cincinnati Milling Machine Company acquired a controlling interest in the Cincinnati Grinder Company. The following year, production moved to Oakley. Along with the factory came something far more valuable: the patents on centerless grinding. What is centerless grinding, and why did it turn an entire industry upside down? The answer requires a moment with the physics. In conventional cylindrical grinding, a workpiece, a shaft, a pin, a valve stem is held between two centers, mounted, ground, removed, and replaced one piece at a time. The process is precise but slow. Every mounting introduces a small chance of error. Every removal costs time. Centerless grinding eliminates the centers entirely. The workpiece rests on a support blade between two rotating wheels, a large grinding wheel that removes material, and a smaller regulating wheel that controls the rotation and feed of the part. Tilt the regulating wheel at a slight angle, typically 1 to 3 degrees, and the workpiece feeds itself through the machine continuously, emerging from the other end ground to tolerance. No chucking, no centering, no stopping. A skilled operator could feed parts in a continuous stream. The machine would return them ground to within fractions of a thousandth of an inch. The implications for mass production were staggering. Pistons, valve stems, roller bearings, fuel injector pins, camshaft journals. Any cylindrical component produced in volume could now be ground faster, more consistently, and at lower cost than had ever been possible. The subsidiary, formally organized as Cincinnati Grinders, Inc., its trademark registered with the U.S. Patent Office in October 1929, moved quickly to perfect the technology in partnership with one of America's most demanding customers. That customer was the Timken Company, the Canton, Ohio bearing manufacturer whose roller bearings went into virtually every American automobile, locomotive, and piece of heavy equipment. Timken needed bearings that were simultaneously cheaper to produce and more precisely ground than anything the previous generation of machinery could deliver. Working with Cincinnati Grinders, they got both. The resulting machines allowed Timken to produce automotive bearings that were lower in cost and higher in precision than their predecessors. The automotive industry took notice immediately. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, all of them depended on bearings, and all of them depended on the companies that ground them. By 1926, with the grinding subsidiary fully integrated and the centerless technology spreading across American industry, Cincinnati Milling Machine Company became the largest machine tool company in the United States. It had started 40 years earlier with 2 men in a rented shop fixing sewing machines. Now it set the standard by which every bearing, every piston, every precision shaft in American manufacturing was measured. The question in the years that followed was whether a company built on precision could survive an imprecise world. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The question of whether America would enter the war was answered in an afternoon. The question of whether American industry could supply a war was answered over the following 18 months, and Cincinnati was at the center of the answer. The mill, as employees had always called the Oakley complex, had survived the Great Depression by leaning on export sales. By 1932, exports represented a third of all revenue, up from 1/5 in 1929. The company had endured by selling precision to a world that needed it. Now the world needed it at a scale no peacetime economy had ever contemplated. Fred Geyer, the younger, reported a figure that is still quoted at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. During the war, the mill produced a new machine tool every 17 minutes. In 1942 alone, 17,511 machines came out of the Oakley plant. 1 in every 12 machine tools manufactured anywhere in the United States that year bore the Cincinnati name. To sustain that output, the company assembled a network of 150 subcontractors spread across the eastern third of the nation. 27 outside foundries shipped castings to Oakley around the clock. The workforce, which had stood at just 250 in the depths of the 1921 contraction, climbed to a wartime peak of 8,561 employees. What did those machines make? everything a modern mechanized army required. Cincinnati's milling machines cut the fins on aluminum cylinder heads for air-cooled aircraft engines, a problem the mill's own engineers solved when the fins proved too thick for adequate cooling. The grinding machines produced the precision surfaces on artillery components, on naval gun barrels, on the roller bearings that went into every tank, every aircraft, every ship in the Allied inventory. Late in the war, the Oakley plant itself produced artillery fuse setters, tractor parts, and dies for ammunition manufacturing. The company had ceased to be merely a machine tool builder and had become a direct component of the arsenal. The lessons of those years went beyond production numbers. The mill learned, at a scale and pace it had never experienced, that precision manufacturing was not a luxury but a strategic asset, that a tolerance of 1/10,000th of an inch on a bearing race could determine whether an engine held together at altitude, whether a gun fired when its crew needed it to. That lesson would shape the company's identity for the next 2 decades. The post-war decades were Cincinnati's fullest expression of what a precision machine tool company could be. The automotive industry was consuming bearings, pistons, and valve trains at a pace that made wartime production numbers look modest. New housing meant new appliances. New appliances meant new motors. New motors meant new bearings. The aerospace industry, growing from wartime roots into the jet age, demanded components ground to tolerances measured in millionths of an inch. Every one of those requirements fed demand for the machines that Cincinnati built. The machines themselves became legendary in the trade. The Cincinnati monoset, a precision tool and cutter grinder introduced in the post-war era, became the standard against which all other tool grinders were measured. The number 2 tool and cutter grinder, with its characteristic green paint and the Cincinnati name cast into the side of the column, appeared in virtually every serious machine shop in the country. Machinists who trained in the 1950s and 1960s learned their trade on Cincinnati equipment. Men who spent entire careers in precision manufacturing remember the feel of those hand wheels and the reliability of those spindle bearings with the kind of specificity that suggests something more than nostalgia. The centerless grinding lines, the Cinco 15, the production series machines with 24-inch grinding wheels capable of holding diameter tolerances within 0.005 of an inch, became the backbone of the American bearing and fastener industries. A well-maintained Cincinnati centerless grinder from the 1960s can still be found running in production shops today. On the secondary market in 2024, a number 2 MT tool and cutter grinder in working condition sells for between $2,450 and $9,450, prices that reflect not antique sentimentality but genuine production utility. These machines were built to last, and they have. From the 1930s through the 1960s, Cincinnati maintained its position as the world's largest machine tool manufacturer. The Oakley complex covered multiple city blocks. Every family in the neighborhood had someone who worked there. The company sponsored Boy Scout troops, donated machine tools to the public high school's metalworking shop, and provided equipment to the continuing education programs at what would later become the University of Cincinnati. In a city that had built its identity on pork packing and beer brewing, Cincinnati milling had created something new, a culture of precision, a civic identity rooted in the making of things that had to be exactly right. It could not last forever. Nothing in American manufacturing did. The threat came slowly, then all at once. Japanese machine tool manufacturers had been rebuilding since 1945, first with American assistance, then with increasing independence. By the late 1960s, companies like Okuma, Mazak, and Mori Seiki were producing machine tools that matched American quality at significantly lower prices. In the 1970s, as the dollar strengthened and American labor costs continued to climb, the price differential became impossible to ignore. Taiwanese manufacturers followed, targeting the mid-market with machines that were good enough for many applications at a fraction of the cost. The numbers tell the story without mercy. In the early 1960s, American machine tool manufacturers controlled roughly 25% of the global market. By 1978, the U.S. share had fallen to around 20%. By the mid-1980s, it had dropped below 10%. Imports, which had been a negligible factor in 1960, captured nearly half the American machine tool market by 1986. Companies that had defined American manufacturing precision for a century found themselves competing on price with manufacturers whose workers earned a fraction of the Ohio wage. Washington noticed, eventually. In 1986, the Reagan administration negotiated a voluntary restraint agreement with Japan, limiting Japanese machine tool imports to specific annual quantities. The agreement was a political gesture as much as an economic policy. It slowed the bleeding without stopping it. Tariffs and quotas could not address the fundamental restructuring of global manufacturing economics that was already underway. The casualties were severe. Kearney and Trecker, the Milwaukee machine tool builder that had been one of Cincinnati's great peers, was absorbed and eventually disappeared. Warner and Swayze, LeBlond, Brown and Sharp's machine tool operations, the names that had defined American machining for a century, were sold, consolidated, or closed. Machine tool industry employment in the United States fell by more than 40% between 1980 and 1987. In Cincinnati, the Oakley plant began to look less like an empire and more like a monument to an era that was ending. The question was whether the mill had the will to fight, or whether it would simply wait to be acquired. Cincinnati's response to the competitive crisis began with a symbolic act. In 1970, the Cincinnati Milling Machine Company reincorporated itself as Cincinnati Millicron, Inc. The name change was not mere marketing. It signaled a deliberate decision to stop defining the company by what it had always made and to define it instead by what precision manufacturing could become. The strategic pivot had two dimensions. The first was rationalization, cutting costs, consolidating facilities, focusing the machine tool business on segments where Cincinnati's engineering depth gave it an advantage over lower-cost competitors. In 1993, excess capacity forced the consolidation of machine tool operations. The second, more consequential dimension was diversification into plastics processing equipment, a market adjacent to metalworking in its precision requirements but insulated from the direct price competition of Japanese imports. The internal transformation came through a program called Project Wolfpack, launched in 1986 in the plastics division and later applied across the company. Cross-functional teams, engineers, production workers, salespeople, and accountants working together rather than in sequence were charged with a specific mandate: improve machine quality while removing 40% of the cost and 40% of the components. According to reporting from the Cincinnati Enquirer in April 1992, the Wolfpack approach fundamentally changed how the company thought about product development. More than 75% of the mill's 1993 machinery sales consisted of products that had not existed 5 years earlier. It worked. After reporting losses in 5 of the 10 years following the peak of the Japanese competitive onslaught, Millicron returned to profitability in 1992. Its plastics machinery plants in Ohio were named among the 10 best plants in America by Industry Week magazine in October 1994. By 1995, nearly half of the company's revenue came from outside the United States. What separated Cincinnati Millicron from the machine tool companies that died was not luck. It was the recognition, made painful and early, that the old identity, America's machine tool king, was no longer sufficient. The companies that clung to that identity found it a shroud. The companies that let it go and built something new while preserving what had always been genuine, the engineering culture, the manufacturing precision, the institutional knowledge accumulated over a century, had a chance. Cincinnati had a chance. Whether it used it wisely is a different question. The decision that effectively ended the Cincinnati Grinders story came in 1998, when Cincinnati Millicron divested its machine tool division entirely and simplified its name to Millicron, Inc. After more than a century of building milling machines, grinding machines, and the precision tools that American industry depended on, the company sold that heritage, sold the Cincinnati name on machine tools, sold the Oakley legacy, sold the institutional knowledge of centerless grinding, and walked away. The buyer was Unova Inc., an industrial holding company. The machine tool assets, including the Cincinnati grinding lines, eventually operated under the name Cincinnati Machine, later drawn into a series of industrial transactions that left the original manufacturing identity fragmented across multiple owners. The Oakley plant, which had employed 8,561 workers at its wartime peak, fell silent. The building that had been a landmark for generations of Cincinnati families sat empty for years before being demolished, replaced by a multiplex cinema and retail development. The machines that had built the arsenal of democracy were gone. In their place, a parking lot and a movie theater. Millicron itself, now a pure plastics equipment company, struggled with the weight of the diversification strategy that had once saved it. Acquisitions in the 1990s, Ferromatic in 1993, DME in 1996, had loaded the balance sheet with debt at precisely the moment when the manufacturing economy began to contract. In March 2009, Millicron Inc. filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, disclosing liabilities exceeding $500 million. The resolution was characteristic of early 21st century American industrial finance. In May 2009, substantially all of Millicron's assets were sold to a company formed by affiliates of Avenue Capital Group and DDJ Capital Management, which together held approximately 93% of the company's outstanding notes, valued at roughly $175 million. The new investors provided an $80 million loan, of which $40 million went directly to Millicron as operating capital. A $55 million revolving credit facility was secured through General Electric Capital Corp. The restructured Millicron LLC emerged from bankruptcy with liabilities reduced by more than $500 million, roughly 80% of what it had owed. A decade later, in November 2019, Hillenbrand Inc. acquired Millicron. In February 2025, Bain Capital purchased a 51% stake. The Cincinnati Milling Machine Company, founded by two men in a rented shop on Vine Street in 1874, built into the world's largest machine tool manufacturer by Frederick Geyer, guided through a world war at one machine every 17 minutes by Frederick V. Geyer, is now a plastics equipment subsidiary of a diversified industrial holding company, partially owned by a private equity firm headquartered in Boston. Is that a failure? Or is it simply what survival looks like in an economy that no longer values what the mill was built to do? The Cincinnati name did not disappear entirely. It persisted in the secondary market for used machine tools, in the hands of rebuilders and repair specialists, in the machine shops where a 40-year-old Cincinnati centerless grinder still holds tolerance on a production run because it was built to last longer than the economy that made it. Cincinnati Service and Rebuilders, Inc. operates today out of the region, staffed by technicians with decades of experience on the Cincinnati and Gold Crown OD grinding product lines. They repair, rebuild, and upgrade the controls and drives on machines that were manufactured when the Oakley plant was still running. There is a market for this work. There will be a market for this work for as long as the machines exist and the knowledge to service them survives. The brand is carried forward, in modified form, by Total Grinding Solutions of Warren, Michigan, which builds and sells Cincinnati-branded centerless grinders globally, machines designed around the legacy platform, updated with current CNC controls and automation systems. The name means something in the industry. It means a standard of precision and a depth of application knowledge accumulated over more than a century, and that does not simply evaporate when a corporate structure changes. In some machine shops today, an older machinist will refer to a grinding specification simply as Cincinnati tolerances, meaning the tightest, the most demanding, the kind that required the best machine and the most skilled hands. That is a legacy. It is not a business plan, but it is something. One machine every 17 minutes. We return to that number because it refuses to be abstract. 17 minutes is the time it takes to drive across Cincinnati. It is roughly the length of a meal break. It is long enough to make a decision that changes everything and short enough that the pressure never lets up. In 1942, the men and women of the Oakley plant made that number real. Not once, not as a record to be celebrated, but as a daily, grinding, unrelenting act of industrial will. They did it because the world required it, because the machines they built were the tools that built the tools that won the war. They did it because that is what precision manufacturing demands. Not inspiration, but discipline. Not genius, but consistency. Not the dramatic gesture, but the correct tolerance, held every time in every part without exception. The factory is gone. The company exists in a different form, under different ownership, making different things. But the standard survives. In every machinist who learned on a Cincinnati grinder, in every bearing that rolls smooth because someone upstream held the tolerance, in every machine shop where the green paint on an old column still means the work will be right. If you work in manufacturing, or if you know someone who does, tell them this story. The machines that made the modern world were not made by accident. They were made in Ohio by people who understood that precision is not a detail, it is the point.